Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I always thought the forest behind our house had a kind of magic. As children, my sister Alice and I spent countless hours there. We pretended to be explorers in a vast, uncharted wilderness. It was our escape, a place where the only limit was our imagination. But that was before the last summer came, before everything changed. It was a typical September evening. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Alice and I, now both at university but home for the winter, decided to visit our childhood sanctuary. It was a spontaneous idea, a nostalgic whim, but it felt right. "Do you remember the old oak tree?" asked Alice, her voice shimmering with excitement as we walked. "I bet it's even bigger now." The forest had grown denser over the years, the familiar paths more overgrown, but the feeling of adventure was the same. We chatted about university, about friends we had made, and courses we had taken. It was comfortable, easy. As we ventured deeper, the familiarity of the landscape began to fade. The trees seemed larger, more menacing, and the air grew cooler. I attributed it to the setting sun and the fact that we hadn't been in these woods for years. Then we found the path. It was narrow, almost hidden, and wound its way through the densest part of the forest. None of us remembered it, but Alice's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Let's see where it leads," she said, already stepping onto it. I hesitated. "Shouldn't we go back? It will be dark soon." Alice laughed. "Are you scared? Come on, it will be fun like old times." Reluctantly, I followed her. The path twisted and wound through the dense underbrush. The further we went, the more I felt that something was wrong. The forest was silent. The usual chaos of birds and insects was alarmingly absent. "Alice, I don't like this," I whispered. A knot of fear formed in my stomach. "Don't be a baby," she teased, but the usual confidence was missing from her voice. Then we saw it, a clearing, perfectly circular, with a single massive tree in its center. Its branches stretched high into the sky, the leaves rustling softly in the wind. It was beautiful, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. Alice was spellbound by it, approaching it as if she were in a trance. "It's incredible." I wanted to tell her that we should leave, that it wasn't right, but the words didn't come out. Instead, I followed her into the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw them, figures, right at the edge of the forest, watching us. Human, but impossibly large. Her skin was a ghostly pale white, her eyes dark holes in their faceless faces. I grabbed Alice's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go. Now." She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear, and nodded. We ran, not daring to look back. The sound of our footsteps and gasping breaths was the only thing that broke the silence. We emerged from the forest just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the last daylight fading. We didn't talk about what we had seen, not then at least. We were too frightened, too confused. That night, I lay awake, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't, and somehow I knew it would only get worse. The day after our encounter in the forest, a palpable tension settled over our house. Alice and I avoided talking about what we had seen, but it hung between us, an unspoken truth that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I also noticed the changes in Alice. She was quieter, more withdrawn. At night, I heard her talking in her sleep, sometimes words that I couldn't quite understand. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress, the pressure of the university weighing down on us. But deep down, I knew it was more. Then came the night that changed everything. I was awakened by a noise, a faint tapping at my window. Sleepy, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. Probably just a branch, I murmured. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a figure standing outside. It was Alice. Her face was pale in the moonlight. "Alice, what are you doing out there?" I whispered, my heart racing. She didn't answer, just stood there and stared at me with wide open eyes. Then she slowly raised a finger to her lips. "Psst," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're listening." Before I could respond, she turned around and walked into the darkness. I quickly threw on a jacket and followed her, my head full of questions. The night was cold. The moon cast long shadows on the ground. I found Alice standing at the edge of the forest, her gaze fixed on the trees. "Alice, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice tinged with fear. "They want me to come to them," she said, her voice distant. "They have something they want to show me." I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away. "We can't go back there, Alice. Do you remember what we saw?" But she just shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the forest. "I have to understand it." I tried to persuade her, but it was as if I were talking to a stranger. She was determined, obsessed. Finally, I reluctantly agreed to accompany her. I couldn't leave her alone to face what was out there. We entered the forest. The darkness enveloped us like a shroud. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunching of leaves beneath our feet. As we walked, I felt eyes on us, watching from the shadows. I wanted to run, to flee, but I forced myself to keep going. We reached the clearing with the giant tree. The moonlight bathed it in a ghostly glow. The figures were there, just as before, their ghostly forms barely visible at the edge of the forest. Alice stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the tree. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. There was a moment of silence. Then a voice, soft and whispering, filled the air. "We have been waiting for you," she said. "You were the chosen one." I felt a chill. "Alice, we have to go now." But she didn't move, her eyes wide open, a mixture of fear and fascination. The voice continued, its tone soothing, hypnotic. I watched as Alice took a step forward. Her body moved as if she were in a trance. "Alice, no!" I screamed and jumped forward to grab her, but it was too late. The figures rushed forward, surrounding her. Their pale forms merged with the night, and then, with a terrifying laugh that echoed through the forest, they were gone, and so was Alice. I was alone. The silence of the forest mocked me. In that moment, I knew I had to find her, to save her from the fate that awaited her in the clutches of these creatures. And as I left the clearing, a terrifying thought struck me. This was just the beginning. The morning after Alice's disappearance, the world seemed eerily normal. Birds chirped outside, the sun shone brightly, but the absence of my sister cast a dark shadow over everything. I tried to tell my parents what had happened, but my story sounded crazy even to my own ears. How could I explain that supernatural beings had taken Alice right in front of me? The local police launched a search and combed through the forest for any signs of her. I joined them, driven by the desperate need to find my sister, to bring her back. But as the hours turned into days, hope began to fade. There was no trace of Alice, no clue as to where she might be. But I couldn't give up. I spent every day in the forest, searching and calling for her. The trees seemed to mock me. Their whispers in the wind sounded like muffled laughter. One evening, as twilight fell, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the forest. It was hidden by overgrowth, its windows shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. Something about it drew me in, a feeling of familiarity that I couldn't place. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace and a few pieces of broken furniture. The air was thick with dust, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the air. As I explored the room, my foot caught on something half buried under a pile of rubble. I knelt down, pushed the debris aside, and then discovered an old, leather-bound book. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed. The book was filled with strange symbols, sketches of the creatures I had seen in the forest, and detailed notes written in hasty scrawl. It was a diary, and as I read, a terrifying story unfolded. The author was a man named William Brooks, who had lived in the cabin over a century ago. He wrote about creatures and called them the Guardians. According to his notes, they were ancient beings older than the forest itself. They lured people into the forest, feeding on their fear and eventually on their souls. William had become obsessed with them, drawn in by their promises of knowledge and power. But as he delved deeper into their world, he realized the terrifying truth. The Guardians were not benevolent spirits, but malevolent entities that used humans for their own dark purposes. The last entries in the diary were frantic, full of fear and regret. William realized that he had to stop them to protect others from their influence. He planned to lure her into a trap by using himself as bait. But the diary ended abruptly, the last page torn out. His fate was unknown. When I closed the book, a feeling of dread washed over me. Alice was trapped in the midst of something ancient and terrifying, and I had no idea how to save her. Nevertheless, I knew that I had to try. For her, and for anyone else who might fall victim to the Guardians. Armed with the knowledge from the diary, I set out to find my sister, to confront the creatures that had taken her. As I stepped out of the cabin, it seemed as if the forest was closing in around me. The darkness grew deeper. I was no longer just searching for Alice. I was also fighting for her soul. With the diary firmly in my hand, I ventured deeper into the forest than I had ever been before. The knowledge that Alice was out there somewhere, possibly in the clutches of the Guardians, fueled my resolve. The forest seemed alive, aware of my presence. The trees whispered secrets in a language I did not understand. I remembered William Whitaker's words, to use oneself as bait. It was a dangerous plan, but it seemed to be the only way to lure out the Guardians. If they truly fed on fear, then I had to be the one to confront them, to show them that I was not afraid. As night fell, the forest became eerily silent. The moon cast an eerie light, creating shadows that twisted and turned around me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm, suppressing the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I reached the clearing with the old tree, the place where Alice had been taken. Here I would make my stand. Come out right now, I shouted into the darkness. I know what you are, and I'm not afraid of you. The air grew colder, and I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. The air grew colder, and I could feel eyes on me, watching me from the shadows. Then they stepped forward. The Guardians, their raw, gaunt forms, materialized around the clearing. Their eyes were dark holes, their skin a sickly pale white. You cannot defy us, one of them hissed, his voice a whisper in the wind. I'm not here to defy you, I replied, my voice firm. I am here because of my sister. Give her back to me. The creatures laughed and mocked me. She belongs to us now, spoke another. She has seen the truth of the forest. I stepped forward, my determination hardened. I will do whatever it takes to get her back. The Guardians circled me, their movements slow and deliberate. Very well, said one of them. But no, human, if you fail, your soul will be ours, like your sister's. I nodded. What must I do? The creatures exchanged glances. Then one of them stepped forward. The creatures exchanged glances. Then one of them stepped forward. There is a ritual that can free her, but it requires a sacrifice, an exchange. My heart sank. What kind of sacrifice? Something precious, something that defines you. I thought of my family, the love we shared, the memories we had created in these woods. And I knew what I had to do. "Okay, I'll do it," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. The guardians nodded, and one of them handed me a dagger whose blade gleamed in the moonlight. Then began the ritual. As I prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, I wondered if this was the right decision. But the thought of saving Alice, bringing her back, pushed all doubts aside. I raised the dagger, ready to do what was necessary. And then everything changed. There I stood in the clearing, the dagger in my hand, and a strange calmness seized me. The guardians circled me, their eyes faintly glowing in the moonlight. I closed my eyes, preparing for what I had to do. But at that moment, a faint sound caught my attention. A whisper, almost inaudible, came from the direction of the old tree. My eyes sprang open, and I lowered the dagger slightly, listening. The whisper became clearer, and to my disbelief, it was Alice's voice. She murmured, her voice full of urgency, sending chills down my spine. I turned to the tree, and there, partially hidden in the shadows, stood Alice. She looked different. Her eyes had a depth I had never seen before. She was alive, but there was a weariness about her that spoke of unspeakable horrors. "Alice," I exclaimed. Relief washed over me. I took a step towards her, but the guards hissed, a warning that stopped me in my tracks. "You can't disturb the ritual." Alice's gaze met mine, and in her eyes, I saw fear, but also determination. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "It's a trap, not a victim. The guardians were not just after our souls. They wanted control, to feed on our fear and submission." "But how do you know that?" I asked, my mind racing. Alice took a deep breath. "When they took me, they showed me visions, truths hidden in the fabric of the world. They have lured people into rituals for centuries, binding them to their will. The guardians became restless, their forms shifting in the darkness." "Don't listen to them," hissed one. "Complete the ritual. You will get what you desire." I looked at the dagger in my hand and then back at Alice. "Okay, but what should we do instead?" "We break the cycle," said Alice. Her voice grew stronger. "Don't let them control you." It sounded impossible, but when I looked into Alice's eyes, I felt a glimmer of hope. Together we could do this. I turned around to face the guardians, my grip on the dagger tightening. "We reject your ritual. We are not your pawns." A collective hissing rose from the creatures. Their forms began to sway like smoke. "You will regret this," they threatened. Their voices were removed. "Others will fall where you stood. Then we will be ready," replied Alice, her voice resolute. When the last guardian disappeared, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted and was replaced by a feeling of peace. Alice and I hugged each other. The bond between us was stronger than ever. We had confronted the unknown and emerged victorious. As Alice and I walked back through the forest, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, a surreal calm prevailed. We had confronted something unimaginable, something ancient and malevolent, and we had survived. The victory felt bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge that our lives would never be the same again. At home, our parents were overjoyed and confused about Alice's return. We told them a version of the truth, leaving out the supernatural elements. It was easier that way. The police closed the case and attributed it to Alice getting lost in the forest. But we knew the truth. In the following weeks, Alice and I spent a lot of time together, often in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We were connected by a shared experience that no one else could understand. I often found myself flipping through William Whitaker's diary again, trying to understand everything. His last entry, which had been torn out, haunted me. I couldn't stop wondering what his last words were, what wisdom or warning he might have left behind. Alice, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The experience in the forest had changed her, given her a new perspective on life. She often spoke of returning to the forest to learn more about the guardians and their true intentions. I hesitated. After everything we had been through, I wanted nothing more than to leave it all behind. But Alice insisted. "We can't just ignore what we know," she insisted. "We must be prepared in case they come back." She was right, of course. Ignorance was no longer an option, not when we knew what lurked in the shadows. One evening, as we sat on the porch and looked into the forest, Alice turned to me. "Tell me, do you sometimes wonder if we really won?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I thought about it. "I don't know, Alice, if it's about winning," I replied. "I think it's about defying them, to show them that we are not afraid." Alice nodded, a thoughtful expression in her eyes. "Yes, maybe that's enough for now." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the echoes of that night in the forest remained, a constant reminder of the unknown that lurked just out of sight. Alice returned to university, throwing herself into her studies with renewed passion. She wanted to learn more about ancient myths and legends to understand the forces we had encountered. As for me, I stayed close to home, keeping an eye on the forest, vigilant for any signs of the Guardian's return. I often thought of William Whitaker, of the sacrifice he was willing to make, and I wondered if one day we would face a similar decision. But before I find that out, I will take the dagger in my hand tonight and kill my sister while she sleeps. Because if I save her, the logical conclusion is that I am next, and I will not allow that under any circumstances. Because in an emergency, there is only one rule: kill or be killed. That has always been the case, and it will always be the case in the future.